The summer of 1944 was unlike any other in northern France. The hedgerows of Normandy, green, thick, ancient, cut the land into a maze of narrow lanes and earthen walls, each one a perfect ambush site. The Americans called it bocage country, though few had ever seen anything like it. Every field, every lane was its own fortress. For the men of the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Division, the war had become a contest of patience and nerve. They had landed on the beaches in June with confidence and firepower, but by July, they were discovering that courage and steel were not enough. What lay ahead was a battlefield that rewarded the cunning, not just the brave. The M4 Sherman tank, reliable, fast, and easy to build, was the backbone of the American armored forces. Yet against the German Panzer and Tigers and the more formidable Panther and Tiger tanks, it was dangerously outmatched. On paper, the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate about 68mm of armor at 1,000 yards. The frontal plate of a Panther measured 80 to 100mm, sloped to deflect even that. In practice, it meant that when a Sherman fired at a Panther head-on, the round often bounced off, while a single German shell could punch clean through the Sherman's hull. The crews knew this imbalance all too well. They joked grimly that the Sherman burned like a Ronson lighter, lights every time. Inside those olive-drab machines, 5 men shared a coffin on tracks: driver, assistant driver, gunner, loader, and commander. The air smelled of cordite and oil, the walls cramped with shell casings and spent hope. In those tight quarters, every clang of incoming fire was personal. By the 3rd week of July, the Allies were bogged down. Operation Cobra, the breakout from the beaches, had yet to begin, and German armor still roamed the countryside, striking from concealment. The Americans had numbers, but numbers meant little in a killing field where every crossroad might hide an ambush gun. A young lieutenant named Frank Davis of the 67th Armored Regiment recalled seeing a Panther fire from 600 yards, the flash blooming from behind a hedgerow. "It hit the tank ahead of us right in the turret," he later said. "Didn't explode, just went through like it wasn't there." When his own gunner returned fire, the American shell hit short. The explosion churned the soil into a geyser of dust. For a second, Davis thought it was a miss until he saw the Panther's crew abandon their vehicle, smoke curling from beneath it. The blast had ricocheted upward under the tank's hull, shattering its belly plates and killing the engine. It was the first German tank they had destroyed that week. News of the strange tank kill spread quickly through the company. Some thought it a lucky fluke, others saw it as a clue, maybe even a new kind of tactic. Within days, crews began to experiment, firing high-explosive HE shells deliberately into the ground in front of their targets. When those shells detonated, they threw up violent bursts of soil and shrapnel that ricocheted upward, tearing into the thin belly armor of German panzers. What had looked like a missed shot now proved deadly. It was a small discovery at first, a single tank knocked out by accident. But on the battlefields of Normandy, every lesson was paid for in blood, and the men learned fast. At first, it seemed counterintuitive. Why shoot at dirt when steel was the problem? Yet the more they tried it, the more it worked. The 75mm HE shell, designed to blast bunkers and infantry, created a violent burst that sent jagged fragments ricocheting upward. Against the thin underbelly of German tanks, barely an inch of armor, it was devastating. The trick was finding the right distance. Too close, and the shell buried itself. Too far, and the fragments lost force. But when it worked, it was lethal. By late July, tank commanders were passing quiet notes to their gunners. Aim low. It wasn't official doctrine, but it was quickly becoming battlefield truth. Captain Robert Kimball, a veteran of North Africa, described the change in tone. "We stopped thinking like tankers and started thinking like hunters. You didn't wait for the perfect shot. You made the ground do the work." In the days before Operation Cobra, the U.S. First Army was learning to improvise. Air power could soften the lines, but it couldn't teach men to survive in the hedgerows. That fell to the crews themselves, men who had learned the hard way that doctrine written in Virginia didn't always survive the mud of Normandy. They began firing in pairs. One tank would draw attention, another would aim low and deliver the real blow. They learned to angle their hulls against ricochet fire, to hide behind hedges instead of charging through them. It was adaptation in real time, born not from orders, but from observation. By the time the breakout began in late July, These small innovations, scattered, informal, unrecorded, had turned into a quiet revolution. The U.S. tankers had found a way to fight smarter with what they had. And for the first time, the kill counts began to even out. In the calm before the storm of Operation Cobra, the men of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions sat in their tanks, engines off, listening to the distant thunder of bombers. They were tired, sunburned, and older than they had been a month before. The fields were silent, but for the sound of cicadas, and the smell of cut wheat hung in the air. They didn't yet know that, within days, their improvised tactic, this strange practice of shooting at the ground, would help tear open the German line and drive the enemy back across France. But they sensed it. They had turned the earth itself into a weapon. The morning of July 25, 1944, dawned under a low gray sky. To the men crouched behind hedgerows south of St. Lo, it was a sky that trembled. By mid-morning, that tremble became a roar, the sound of 1,500 Allied bombers unleashing the opening blow of Operation Cobra. The bombardment was so massive that even seasoned soldiers flinched. The earth convulsed. Fields disappeared in sheets of black smoke. For the armored crews waiting to move, the noise was physical, a steady pounding in the chest. Then came the silence that follows ruin, the kind of silence that demands movement. Major General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps advanced into the breach, and with them rolled the Shermans. The American tanks moved cautiously at first. Every hedgerow felt like a threat. From behind them, German panzers, mainly Panzer IVs and Stugee IIIs, waited with engines cold, letting the Americans come close before firing. But something had changed in the way the U.S. crews fought. Instead of firing directly at the muzzle flash or turret silhouette, some gunners deliberately aimed short. The HE rounds struck the earth in front of the German positions, kicking up fountains of dirt, smoke, and fragments. The effect was stunning. Gun sights blinded, crews rattled, tracks shredded by shrapnel, and the belly armor of tanks ruptured from beneath. Lieutenant Davis, the same young officer who had seen his first lucky ricochet weeks earlier, watched through his periscope as his gunner, Corporal Sam Whitaker, adjusted the range dial. "Low," Davis murmured. Whitaker didn't look up. "Copy." The 75 milliput fired. The shell buried itself shallowly into a plowed field 20 yards before the target, then detonated. A column of flame and soil leapt skyward. When the dust cleared, the Panzer's tracks were twisted, its turret still. Davis exhaled. That's it, again. It was not precision marksmanship, it was adaptation. The tactic spread not by order, but by observation. Tankers from one platoon noticed how another's missed shots seemed to do more harm than their direct hits. Word moved fast through mess tents and radio chatter. Try hitting the dirt first. In the 3rd Armored Division, known as Spearhead, some commanders began to integrate the technique formally. They paired HE fire with maneuver. One tank would fire at the ground to disrupt the enemy's sightline, while another flanked for the killing shot with armor-piercing rounds. Captain John Irwin, whose company fought through the villages near Perrier, later explained it in plain terms. You couldn't outgun a Panther, but you could outthink its crew. They were trained to expect duels. We gave them chaos. The HE ricochet turned the battlefield into a guessing game. To a German gunner inside his steel shell, explosions no longer came from predictable angles. Dust, smoke, and debris clouded optics. Turret rings jammed. Track links snapped. The Americans had found a way to turn the ground itself into an ally. For the first time, the Germans began to underestimate what they saw. When a Sherman's round struck the earth short, they assumed it was a miss until shrapnel chewed through their vision ports. In the hedgerows around Coutances and Marigny, German units reported an alarming pattern. The enemy fires low. Our tanks are struck from beneath. Intelligence officers dismissed it as misinterpretation, but the frontline soldiers knew better. Even as the American tanks advanced, many crews still carried doubts. They knew the danger of closing the distance. They had seen too many Shermans brew up like paper lanterns. But the ricochet technique gave them something new: initiative. They could fight back, not as victims of superior machines, but as problem solvers. By early August, the results were undeniable. A field report from the 2nd Armored noted an increase in confirmed Panzer kills, often achieved by indirect detonation of HE at close range. No official manual mentioned it, yet after-action logs began to include phrases like airburst undercarriage hit or he ricochet effect observed. In one day's fighting near Le Désert, a single Sherman platoon knocked out 4 German vehicles using a mix of airburst and ground strike HE fire. Their commander wrote simply, "Improvisation, not luck." But innovation in war is never clean. For every success, there was tragedy. A mistimed shot could detonate too close and shower its own crew in fragments. Sometimes ricochet fire bounced unpredictably, scattering lethal metal toward friendly infantry. Still, the tankers persisted. They were men of instinct, not doctrine. And in the summer of 1944, instinct mattered most. The U.S. Army had entered Normandy with faith in production and planning. It was leaving the bocage with a harder lesson, that wars are not won by machines, but by the imagination of those who drive them. The next phase of the campaign, as the American columns broke into open country, would prove the lesson beyond doubt. The ricochet method, born of desperation, would help open the road to avalanches and turn the tide of the campaign. By August 1st, 1944, the world around Avranches was coming apart. What began as a cautious push through the Norman hedgerows had erupted into a full-throated advance. Operation Cobra had done its work. The German front was split, their divisions reeling. The Americans were no longer crawling through fields. They were surging through gaps, engines roaring, dust trailing like banners. But for the men in the tanks, the danger hadn't lessened. Every crossroads, every copse of trees could still conceal a gun or a panther waiting for its chance. Lieutenant Davis and his crew were part of that drive south. Their Sherman, Lucky Lily, stenciled in white on the hulls, was battered, paint scorched and dulled by dust. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and sweat. Davis sat half out of the commander's hatch, binoculars pressed to his eyes, the landscape rolling by like a film reel of smoke and ruin. Ahead, a village shimmered in the August heat. Marigny, one of the last German strongholds before the breakout road to Avranches. The Americans had been told to expect resistance. They got it. The first shot came from somewhere beyond a church steeple. A Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun barked once, and a Sherman to Davis's right erupted in orange fire. The blast wave hit his chest like a hammer. "Panther, 11 o'clock!" he shouted. Whitaker, his gunner, swung the turret. "Got him, range 700. "Hold your fire," Davis ordered, almost on instinct. "Aim short, 200 under." The cannon thundered. The HE shell struck the cobblestone road 10 yards before the Panther. The explosion sent a sheet of debris upward, shards of rock, metal, and flame. Through the smoke, Davis saw the Panther jolt as if kicked from beneath. Its gun sagged. "Hit!" Whitaker shouted. "He stopped!" "Do it again." A second round, another explosion beneath. The German tank began to smoke, its crew scrambling out. One stumbled, fell. The others fled into the alleyways. Davis lowered his binoculars. "That's how we do it now." All along the front, similar scenes played out. Sherman crews, once derided for their light armor, were hitting back with ingenuity. Reports from the 4th Armored Division told of multiple kills by indirect HE fire. "Ricochet strike under hull," one after-action note read. "Crew neutralized." The Germans, long accustomed to dictating the terms of armored combat, began to lose their rhythm. The Panther's gun, designed for long-range duels, was ill-suited to the smoke-choked lanes of bocage towns. Its narrow field of view and poor maneuverability made it a giant trapped in a maze. Meanwhile, the Americans had learned flexibility. One platoon used HE ground bursts to blind German optics, while another flanked for the kill. Another fired low to detonate mines or dislodge entrenched infantry. What had begun as a trick had evolved into a doctrine of improvisation. By August 3rd, Avranches was in American hands. The road to Brittany lay open. General Patton's Third Army poured through the gap, the breakout complete. The German 7th Army, encircled and battered, was falling back toward Falaise. For the tankers who had survived the bocage, the change was intoxicating. Open country meant mobility, the one advantage their Shermans could exploit without reservation. But it also meant exposure. And so, even as they raced across France, the lessons of Normandy stayed with them. When the terrain opened, they still fired low. When the range closed, they aimed for the ground. They had learned something essential. That victory wasn't only about the weapon you held, but how you thought to use it. In a field outside Coutances, days after the breakout, Lieutenant Davis sat on the turret of his tank, helmet off, watching the sun set over the wreckage of burned Panzers. His crew was quiet. A supply truck passed on the road, men waving as it rattled by. Whitaker climbed up beside him, passing a cigarette. "Think they'll ever believe how we did it?" Davis smiled faintly. "Maybe, but they don't have to. We just have to get home." He looked down the road, where the light caught the glint of another column of Shermans rolling forward, dozens of them, engines grumbling, dust rising. It wasn't elegance. It wasn't technology. It was persistence, bound to ingenuity, carried by men who refused to quit. That was how the tide turned, not in a single moment, but in thousands of quiet decisions, each one a gamble that worked just enough to make a difference. By September 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy were far behind them. The fields were wider now, the villages farther apart, and the war was moving east, toward the German border, toward the endgame. But the lessons of that strange summer lingered in the minds of every American tanker who had fought there. The ricochet shot, born of desperation, refined through blood and dust, had become an unspoken craft, passed from crew to crew. It was never written into manuals, never diagrammed in training circulars, yet it became part of the quiet vocabulary of survival. Those who had seen it work never forgot the sound, the dull thump of the shell striking dirt, the upward howl of shrapnel, and then the heavy silence that followed when the enemy stopped firing. It was the sound of adaptation, of men using the ground beneath them as their greatest weapon. In the months that followed, as the Sherman battalions crossed France and entered Belgium, the tactical mindset that had begun in Normandy matured. Tankers grew sharper, faster, more cunning. They had learned to trust their instincts over doctrine, to find advantage in what others overlooked. An after-action report from the 5th Armored Division summed it up in one understated line: enemy losses attributable not to superior equipment, but to superior adjustment. That word, adjustment, became the essence of the American way of war in Europe. The Germans still had the better tanks. The Panthers and Tigers remained fearsome opponents, their long guns capable of slicing through a Sherman at 1,000 yards. But the U.S. crews had turned the battlefield into a game of misdirection, of concealment and speed. They fired low to confuse rangefinders, used dust clouds to hide their movements, and made the terrain itself a weapon. In a war too often defined by mass and machinery, it was human ingenuity that made the difference. When historians later studied the Normandy campaign, they spoke of logistics, air superiority, and numbers. Few mentioned the split-second decisions made inside those cramped steel coffins. Few wrote about how, in the chaos of battle, an act as small as aiming for the ground had changed outcomes. Yet for the men who had been there, it was the most tangible proof that courage wasn't blind. It was inventive. Corporal Whitaker survived the war. Years later, when asked about those days in the bocage, he paused before answering. "You learn things fast when the other guy's better armed," he said quietly. "You start looking for the cracks in the world, the little places where the rules don't apply. That's where you survive." He smiled faintly. "That's where we found ours, in the dirt." By the war's end, the M4 Sherman had earned a reputation that was both loved and cursed. It was called the tank that won the war, and also the death trap. Both were true. What made the difference wasn't steel or horsepower, but the minds inside the turret. In Normandy, the U.S. Army learned something profound. Technology mattered, but adaptation mattered more. The ricochet technique was only one example, a small story in a vast and terrible war, but it captured a truth that echoed through the entire campaign. War is a contest not of weapons, but of wit. And sometimes the path to victory begins with the simplest of acts. A man, under fire, choosing to aim a little lower, so that when the shell strikes earth, it rises again.